everyone, it's Matt here from Scoop and Response, and today we've got a video from a session that was streamed on Twitch on Sunday the 17th. Our players for the session are Haku, piloting Najeela, the Blade Blossom, Coxy, piloting Kiki-Jiki, Mirror Breaker, T, piloting Kozilek, the Great Distortion, and Matt, piloting Yawgmoth, Thran Physician. T won the play and starts us off. T draws for turn and plays an Inventor's Fair. He taps it to play Voltaic Key and passes. Matt draws for turn and plays a Swamp. He then taps it and plays a Mitch's Bauble. He then passes. Haku draws for turn and plays a Forbidden Orchard. He taps it to give Matt a 1/1 spirit in order to play a Bird of Paradise. He passes the turn. Coxy draws for turn and plays a Nykthos, Shrine to Nyx. He passes. T untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Wasteland and he passes. Matt untaps and draws for turn. He plays another Swamp. He then casts an Arcane Signet. He decides not to attack on account of him being terrible at attacking with creatures. He passes. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He plays an Underground Sea and gives T a 1/1 spirit. He casts Imperial Recruiter. He searches for a Noble Hierarch and puts it into his hand. He passes. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Reliquary Tower and taps him to cast Blade of Selves. He passes. T untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Waste and he passes. Matt untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Swamp and cracks his Mitch's Bauble to fetch up a tapped Swamp and passes the turn. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Windswept Heath and cracks it to fetch for a Taiga. He casts his Noble Hierarch and also a Herald of Dromoka. He sends his Imperial Recruiter for 2 damage at Coxy due to the Exalted effect from Noble Hierarch. Coxy declares no blocks and passes the turn. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. He sighs, still stuck on red sources, and plays a Terrain Generator and casts an Umbral Mantle before he passes the turn. T untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Swarm Yard and casts a Nev's Disc. He passes, not doing a whole lot so far this game. Matt untaps and draws for turn. He casts Revel in Riches and plays a Blighted Fen before he passes. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Badlands and casts a Wind of Change. Everyone except Coxy sighs and discards their hand before drawing a new hand of the same number of cards. Matt shuffles a discarded Blightsteel Colossus back into his deck. Haku passes the turn. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. With much relief, he plays a Fabled Passage and searches for a mountain. It comes into play untapped due to him having a total of 4 lands, and then casts Goblin Matron and searches up for a Skirk Prospector. He then passes the turn. T untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Waste, and after some time in the tank, he activates Nev's Disc. Everyone's board is wiped, and Matt creates 5 treasure tokens due to Revel in Riches, seeing all creatures leave play. T then casts a Mana Vault and taps it, plus his remaining lands to cast Mycosynth Lattice. The table looks at the lattice with concern while T passes. Matt untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Swamp and casts a Heraldic Banner, naming Black, which won't do anything other than tap for mana while the Mycosynth Lattice is in play. This is due to Lattice making all permanents colourless. He then casts a Magus of the Coffers and passes the turn. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He casts an Arcane Signet and Najeela, his commander, and then he passes for turn. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. He casts a Skirk Prospector and a Goblin Rabblemaster. He moves to combat, making a 1/1 Goblin in the process, and sends it at T, who declares no blocks. He passes the turn. T untaps. In his upkeep, T gains life from his Inventor's Fair due to having 3 or more artifacts, and then loses a life due to Mana Vault being tapped. He draws for turn, and then plays a Drownyard Temple. He casts Mimic Vat, and then Filigree Familiar, gaining 2 life from the Familiar ETB. He then passes the turn. Matt untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Swamp and activates Magus of the Coffers to generate 6 mana due to him having 6 swamps. He then casts Ambition's Cost, bringing him down to 2 mana floating. He draws 3 cards and then cheats, only losing 2 life instead of 3. He then casts Woe Strider and makes a goat token due to the Woe Strider ETB. He then casts Skull Clamp. He equips the clamp to his goat and draws 2 cards. He then casts Dreadhorde Invasion. He casts his Commander Yawgmoth, Thran Physician, with the treasure tokens, leaving 1 remaining. He then passes the turn. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He plays a Forest and casts Chief of the Scale, which gives all of his warriors +1/+0, and then he casts Shana, Sisei's Legacy. Haku moves to combat and sends Najeela at T. In the process, Najeela creates a 1/1 warrior which is aimed at Coxy. T blocks with Filigree Familiar, both creatures die, and T draws a card from Filigree Familiar. T then exiles it under Mimic Vat. Coxy declares no blocks. Haku passes the turn. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. He then sacrifices his goblin token to generate 1 red mana to Skirk Prospector and casts his commander Kiki-Jiki Mirror Breaker. He then activates Kiki-Jiki's ability and creates a token copy of Goblin Rabblemaster. He moves to combat, generating 2 goblin tokens with haste, which must attack due to Rabblemaster's ability. He sends all creatures to attack T. T declares no blocks and takes 15 damage. Coxy passes the turn, sacrificing the created token in the process. T untaps. In his upkeep, T gains a life due to Inventor's Fair and loses a life due to Mana Vault being tapped. T draws for turn and feels sad. Haku explains he's also sad as he's holding a choke in hand, which is useless in this game as it only affects his islands. T pays to untap his Mana Vault and cast Key to the City. He then passes the turn. Matt untaps. In his upkeep, Matt loses a life and creates a zombie army token due to Dreadhorde Invasion. He draws for turn and plays a land for turn. He generates 7 mana with Magus of the Coffers. He then equips Skullclamp to his zombie army token and draws 2 cards. He casts Solemn Simulacrum and searches for a tapped swamp to put into play. He equips his Skullclamp to Solemn Simulacrum and activates Yawgmoth's ability, paying 1 life and sacrificing his Solemn Simulacrum, put a -1 counter on Skirk Prospector. He draws 3 cards from Solemn Simulacrum and Skullclamp. T chooses to exile the Solemn Simulacrum under his Mimic Vat. Matt casts a Priest of Forgotten Gods and a Phyrexian Arena. He equips the Skullclamp to Woe Strider and passes the turn. Haku untaps and draws for turn. He moves straight to combat, sending everything at Coxy. He generates 4 warrior tokens, and before blocks are declared, activates Najeela to untap his creatures and give them lifelink, haste, and trample. In response, Matt casts Doomblade, targeting Najeela. Coxy declares no blocks and takes 14 damage. Haku gains 14 life and then passes the turn. Coxy untaps and draws for turn. He activates Nykthos to play Pilgrim's Eye and then plays a mountain. He then activates Kiki-Jiki and targets Pilgrim's Eye. He searches for another mountain, leaving it in hand, and then casts Shrieking Mog. Shrieking Mog ETBs and taps all other creatures on the battlefield. He then generates a 1/1 token due to Rabblemaster and sends the token in combat and the Shrieking Mog at T, who before blocks are declared, creates a Solemn Simulacrum token with the Mimic Vat. He then searches his library for a waste and puts it onto the battlefield tapped, blocking Shrieking Mog, which dies. T chooses to exile Shrieking Mog under the Mimic Vat. Coxy passes the turn, sacrificing the Pilgrim's Eye token in the process. T untaps. In his upkeep, T gains a life due to Inventor's Fair and loses a life due to Mana Vault. He thinks about his life choices and then passes the turn. Matt untaps. In his upkeep, Matt loses 2 life due to Phyrexian Arena and Dreadhorde Invasion. He draws a card and generates a 1/1 zombie army token. Matt draws for turn. Matt casts Vampiric Tutor and loses 2 life. He solitaires for a while before deciding on the card to put on top of his library. He activates Magus of the Coffers to generate 8 mana. He activates Priest of the Forgotten Gods and sacrifices his zombie army and his Woe Strider. He draws a total of 3 cards due to Skullclamp on the Woe Strider and generates 2 black mana for a total of 10 black mana floating. Each other player then sacrifices a creature and loses 2 life. Haku sacrifices a token and Coxy sacrifices his Rabblemaster, who he deems to be too much of a liability. T has no creatures. Matt then plays a Cabal Stronghold and activates it, bringing a total of 15 mana floating. He pays 3 to cast Veto, Thorn of the Dusk Rose, and casts Exsanguinate, where X is equal to 17 with his remaining mana untapped. Each player loses 17 life, and Matt gains 51 life. Veto triggers, and Haku is dealt another 51 damage, eliminating him from the game. With Coxy on 3 life and T on 6 life, Matt passes the turn on 82 life. Coxy untaps and draws. He casts Combat Celebrant, which will create an infinite win right on the spot if left unchecked. Combat Celebrant enters the battlefield, and Coxy activates Kiki-Jiki, targeting Combat Celebrant. In response, Matt activates Yawgmoth, sacrificing a creature and losing a life. He draws a card and puts a -1 counter on Combat Celebrant, which fizzles the Kiki-Jiki activation. In response, Coxy activates Nykthos. The stack clears, and Mitch casts Blasphemous Act, killing all creatures on the board. Coxy passes the turn. T untaps. In his upkeep, T gains a life due to Inventor's Fair and loses a life due to Mana Vault. T draws for turn and casts a Mana Crypt. T sacrifices Inventor's Fair. He searches for Rings of Brighthearth. He plays Basalt Monolith and realizes he's miscounted his available mana, leaving him 1 short of infinite and preventing him from winning the game this turn. He considers his options and casts Planar Bridge with his remaining mana before he passes the turn. Matt and Coxy sigh with relief. Matt untaps. In his upkeep, Matt loses 2 life due to Phyrexian Arena and Dreadhorde Invasion. He draws a card and generates a 1/1 zombie army token. T activates Wasteland on Matt's Cabal Stronghold before he can move to his main phase. Matt draws for turn and plays a swamp. He casts Liliana, Heretical Healer. He skull clamps his zombie army token, drawing 2 cards. The Liliana creature flips into the Planeswalker, Liliana, Defiant Necromancer, due to a creature dying, and creates a 2/2 zombie token. Matt goes into the tank. After a few moments, he finds the line he needs to win. He casts Carrion Feeder and activates Liliana, returning Veto, Fawn of the Dusk Rose, to the battlefield. He casts Demonic Tutor and searches up Grey Merchant of Asphodel into his hand, which he then casts, dealing 6 damage to each other player. He gains 12 life, and with Veto's trigger, he sends an additional 12 damage to T, eliminating all remaining opponents and taking the game down.